This is the second program in a two-part series covering the disassembly and assembly techniques for the Revolution engine. This program features the 2003 Revolution engine. Though the components in future model years may share a similar design, always refer to the service manual for the year and model of the motorcycle that you are working on for complete instructions, specifications, and warnings. In addition, service bulletins may also provide you with information concerning part, product, or procedural changes. Servicing the Revolution engine can be broken down into two areas: transmission and lower end, and top end and cylinders. In this program, we will be presenting an overview of the procedures for servicing the top end and cylinders. To service the top end, the engine must be removed from the frame. Review PhD 163 for details on this procedure. The cooling system should be drained using the drain ports in the cylinder block, and the oil should be drained from the crankcase. We will begin by mounting the engine into the stand using the Harley-Davidson engine cradle attachment. The cradle attaches directly to the engine with metric fasteners. With the engine mounted, begin the disassembly by disconnecting the sensor connectors and remove the throttle bodies by loosening the two clamps. Remove the fuel rail by first removing the two bolts attaching the assembly to the manifolds. You will need to hold the nut under these bolts. Remove the remaining bolt attaching the manifold to the head and rotate the manifold so that the fuel rail can be removed with the injectors. Pull up on the front injector until it's free from the cylinder, and then lift up to remove the rear. Cylinder head disassembly begins by removing the ignition coils, spark plugs, and the cam covers. The disassembly continues with the removal of the inspection cover, followed by the 14 alternator cover fasteners. Follow the torque sequence in the service manual during removal. All of the cover bolts are the same length. Two gasket alignment dowels are installed to guide the cover during removal. These pins should be on opposite sides of the cover. The alternator stator cover removal installation tool is mounted to the cover using the two inspection cover screws. Turn the hand screw in to pull the cover away from the cases. Most of the resistance is from the magnetic fields of the rotor. The alignment pins can be removed along with the gasket. These formed gaskets should not be reused or used with sealants. Next, remove the clutch cover, clutch, and oil pump as we showed in PhD 166. The balancer gear should only be loosened if the balancer is to be serviced. Use an extension on the breaker bar to hold the crankshaft while you loosen the rotor bolt, triple sprocket bolt, and starter limiter gear bolt. Next, the front cylinder must be positioned at top dead center, overlap. Install the TDC positioning tool in the front cylinder. Rotate the engine using the rotating wrench in a counterclockwise direction while observing the exhaust valve. As the exhaust valve closes, watch the center post of the tool to position it at its highest point. Insert the crankshaft locking pin into the case. Rock the crankshaft until the pin drops into place. Then, thread the pin in fully and remove the TDC reference tool. Remove the rotor bolt and thread the rotor removal tool into the rotor by hand. An air wrench can be used to pull the rotor free of the crankshaft. With the rotor removed, the starter limiter gear can be removed, followed by the snap ring, which retains the gear ball clutch. The assembly can now be slid off the crankshaft. To disassemble the cam drive, the load on the front cylinder cams must be released. To do this, install the tappet compressing tool. First, loosen the center nut on the tool and attach it with two 6 by 25 millimeter fasteners. With the tool in place, tighten the nut to compress the valves and remove the valve spring load on the camshaft. Remove the front and rear cam chain tensioners at this time and mark them for location. Next, remove the bolts from all of the cam bearing caps. Each cap has a different number that matches the number on the cylinder head to prevent mismatching during assembly. The cams can now be lifted out of the journals and the chains removed from the sprockets. Both intake cams are the same, and the exhaust cams are also identical between the front and rear cylinders. All 4 cam sprockets are identical. The cam sprockets should not be removed unless replacement is needed. The sprockets on the front cylinder camshafts have the sprocket boss facing out. On the rear, the boss faces in. Refer to the manual diagram for sprocket alignment. In this section, we will demonstrate the service procedures for the water pump and thermostat. These components do not need to be disassembled to service other engine components. To remove the water pump, loosen the 7 cover bolts and separate the cover and insert gasket from the pump body. Use a soft mallet to loosen the pump body from the cases and pull the pump free. The impeller bearings and internal seals of the pump are not service parts. If damaged, the pump assembly is replaced. 2 bolts attach the thermostat housing to the case. Remove these bolts and pull the housing from the engine. The thermostat controls the flow of coolant to the radiator depending on coolant temperature. Below 85 degrees centigrade or 185 degrees Fahrenheit, the thermostat is closed and coolant flow is limited to the engine, allowing the engine to reach operating temperature rapidly. Above this temperature, the thermostat opens and the coolant flows through the radiator to transfer the heat. If the engine is slow to warm up or if it overheats, the thermostat can be at fault. To replace the thermostat, use the special tool. Push the tool in to compress the spring on the thermostat and then turn the tool 90 degrees counterclockwise to remove. If the housing is removed, the O-rings on each end of the tubes connecting the housing must be replaced along with the gasket. Lubricate all coolant system O-rings with coolant during assembly. With the housing off, remove the 3 5mm head bolts followed by the 4 main head bolts. The main bolts are an external E14 Torx fastener, requiring a special socket such as this snap-on socket for removal. This Harley-Davidson special tool is attached to the exhaust port studs to hold the cylinder head for service. If the cylinder head is to be disassembled, mark the tappets with a number stamped in the head before removal. You should record the locations and sizes of the shims used to aid you in reassembly as well. After removing the tappets and shims, use the Harley-Davidson valve spring compressor to depress the spring and remove the keepers. The valve guide seals must be replaced if the valves were removed. Use the snap-on tool to pull the seal off the guide. To install, position the lower collar first and then install the tapered pin from the installation tool over the valve stem and press the seal into position. The valve springs are progressively wound and are installed with tightly wound coils facing the cylinder head. Refer to the service manual for procedures for servicing the valve seats and guides. To service the cylinders, we proceed to remove the upper chain tensioner blades by using the special tool. Thread the tool into the pin and pull the pin free to release the blade. To remove the primary tensioner shoes, first retract the rear blade with the compression tool. Remove the 2 bolts to free the assembly. With the hydraulic tensioner removed, remove the single bolt and slide the fixed blade off the supports. Next, remove the triple sprocket bolt and push the water pump drive shaft towards the clutch side to free the sprocket and chain for removal. To gain access to the pistons and cylinders, the cases must be separated. Remove the clutch using the procedure shown in PhD 166. The balancer gear can be left in place unless you intend on servicing the balancer bearings. With the help of an assistant, lift off the lower case. The transmission shafts can remain in the lower case. You will need to check the alignment of the transmission bearing pins before reassembly. Install the crankshaft assembly retainers to stabilize the crankshaft for removal of the connecting rods. Loosen and remove the connecting rod caps. Remove the crankshaft supports and lift the crankshaft out of the cases. Remove and discard the rod and main bearing inserts and the 2 thrust bearings from the clutch side of the case. These bearings cannot be reused. Mark the connecting rods and push them up out of the top of the cylinder. Do not let the rod contact the piston jet or cylinder wall during removal. To remove the pistons from the rods, use a small screwdriver to twist the clips from the retaining groove. Never reuse these clips. Refer to the service manual for the specification for measuring the journals, pistons, and cylinders to determine serviceability. The primary gear on the crankshaft should only be removed if replacement is warranted. Mount the crankshaft in the support fixture to hold the assembly during removal and installation. All fasteners must be replaced if they are removed. The cylinders can be deglazed with a ball hone during service, but they should not be honed. If the cylinders are damaged or do not meet size specifications, they must be replaced. New cylinder liners are matched and sold with new piston and ring sets. This special tool is used to pull the cylinder liner out of the cases and to install a new one. The tool mounts to the top of the cylinder using the bolts from the tool kit. When the brace is attached, thread the center rod until it extends well below the cylinder. Rotate the case so that you can install the removal plate. The bearing is installed so that the inner race faces the washer and nut. Tighten the nut to hold the assembly. Rotate the center shaft to pull the liner up. Remove the tool to extract the liner. Before installing a new liner, clean the cases and the machine step to remove any scale or deposits. Coat the O-ring on the liner with motor oil. Insert the liner in the case with the assembly plug on the liner. The cross brace and screw can now be positioned and attached to the case. Press the liner in until the flange seats and is level with the case surface. When installing the pistons onto the rods, you must orient the parts using these markings. These bumps on the rod will face the cam drive side of the engine on the front cylinder and the water pump side on the rear. The EX on the piston faces forward on the front cylinder and towards the rear on the rear cylinder. With the pistons and rings installed on the rods, lightly oil the surfaces and install the ring compressor as shown. Using your hand as a guide to prevent the rod from contacting the cylinder walls and piston jet, lower the assembly into place. Do not force the piston into the cylinder. Ring or cylinder damage can occur. To select the correct size bearing for the crankshaft and rods, use the codes stamped on the counterweight of the crankshaft. The sizes are listed beginning from the alternator side of the crankshaft. On this engine, the main bearings will be green and the rod bearings will be red. Bearing sizes can be determined by measuring the journals and then using the chart in the service manual to determine the correct bearing color code. Never touch the bearing surface of a non-oil bearing with your fingers, as it will etch the bearing surface. Position the bearings in the correct locations and install them, paying close attention to the indexing of the tab on the bearing with the notch in the part. Install the new thrust bearing and lower crankshaft into the upper case. Install the crankshaft retainers to support the crankshaft during rod assembly. Pull the connecting rod up into position. Double-check the orientation of the rod bumps and the piston markings. Lubricate the journal and install the caps. The number on the cap and rod must match. When the caps fully seat, install the bolts. Torque the cap bolts to the specified torque. Next, using a torque angle gauge, tighten each an additional 90 degrees. With the rods installed, rotate the engine and install the crankshaft locking tool to position the crankshaft at top dead center. Prepare the lower cases for assembly by inspecting the indexing of the transmission shaft bearing pins in the case and installing the balancer alignment pin. Remove the crankshaft retainer blocks and apply VRSC crankcase sealer following the chart in the service manual. Install the 2 crankcase alignment dowels. With the help of an assistant, lower the case into position. When the balancer and crankshaft gear are close to engagement, remove the alignment pin and hand position the gears into alignment. Remove the alignment pins and hand thread all 19 case bolts into position. Use the service manual to identify lengths and torque sequences. The torque sequence starts with tightening all 19 fasteners to 25 Newton meters or 18.4 foot-pounds in the specified sequence. Now, back off the 4 main bearing bolts 1 full turn in the correct sequence. Next, retorque these 4 bolts to 15 Newton meters or 11 foot-pounds. Using a torque angle gauge, tighten each bolt 90 degrees further in the sequence specified. Assembly of the cam drive components begins by inserting the water pump shaft until it is flush with the case on the cam drive side. Position the triple sprocket and chain and slide the shaft out to support the sprocket. The sprocket is timed to the crankshaft. The crankshaft is at TDC as confirmed by the installation of the locating pin. While pinching the chain, the mark on the sprocket must align with the case markings as you see here. Install the fixed tensioner. There is a flat that must be aligned in the bore for the upper mount. Walk the chain into place in the track on the tensioner by using a screwdriver. With the tensioner compressed with the tool, position the hydraulic tensioner and bolt it to the case. Release the tensioner and check the alignment of the timing marks. Torque all fasteners to specification. Install the bolt in the triple sprocket. We will torque this bolt after the rotor is installed. Identify the location of the upper chain tensioners. The rear has an 8 mm hole. The 2 center tensioners interlock and have a 10 mm bore, and the front also uses a 10 mm bore. Position the tensioner blade and install the 8 mm pin through the case. Use the shaft from the removal tool, but do not force the pins. Install the center tensioners with the curved blade in the front cylinder's chamber, and then install the final tensioner. With the tensioners in place, the cylinder heads are installed. The head gaskets are not identical. The gaskets are marked top to ensure correct installation. When the heads are in place, the fixed tensioner blade is locked in the head. Lubricate the threads and heads of the main head bolts with engine oil and thread them in. Following the chart in the manual, torque the head bolts to the initial specification. When all 4 bolts in each head are torqued, back them off 1 full turn. Finally, use a torque angle gauge to tighten the bolts in sequence 90 degrees to their final tension. Install and torque the 3 remaining smaller bolts in each head. While all 4 camshaft sprockets are the same, they are installed on the camshafts differently, depending on their location. The sprocket boss on the front cylinder sprockets faces out. On the rear, they will face in. You will also need to use the IN and EX marks to position the sprockets on the camshafts if they have been removed. Install the cam chains on the triple sprockets with the double copper links aligned as shown with the sprocket's timing mark. Install the rear exhaust cam so that the copper link in the chain aligns with the single mark by the EX mark, and the line with 4 dots is parallel to the gasket surface, as shown here. Now install the rear intake camshaft, aligning the copper link with the mark by the IN on the sprocket, and the line with the 3 dots parallel to the head as shown here. If the alignment matches the diagram in the service manual, oil the camshaft journals and install the support caps. The number on the cap must match the number on the head, and the arrow casting will face toward the center of the head. Torque the caps as specified in the service manual. Install the hydraulic tensioner and torque it to specification. Install the tappet compression tool to depress both the intake and exhaust valves on the front cylinder. Position the chain for the front cylinder on the triple sprocket so that the double copper link is aligned with the mark on the sprocket as shown here. Lubricate the journals and install the front cylinder exhaust camshaft so the copper link aligns with the dot by the EX mark and the line with the single dot is parallel with the head as shown here. Install the intake cam again, aligning the dot by the IN mark with the copper link. The line with the two dots should be parallel with the head as shown here. Verify the timing to the diagram in the manual and install the camshaft support caps in their specified locations and torque them to specification. Now remove the tappet compression tools and install the hydraulic unit and torque it to specification. Remove the crankshaft locking tool and proceed to inspect the valve lash using the procedure outlined in PhD 163 and in the service manual. To complete assembly, install the gear ball clutch using a new retaining ring followed by the starter reduction gear. Install the rotor and torque the rotor bolt. Use an extension on the breaker bar to hold the crankshaft. First, torque the bolt to 60 foot-pounds or 82 newton meters. Then back the bolt out one turn and torque it to a final setting of 180 newton meters or 132 foot-pounds. The triple sprocket and starter reduction gear bolts should be torqued to specifications at this time. Continue to assemble the clutch and primary components as we demonstrated in PhD 166. Use the gasket alignment dowels and the alternator cover tool to install the alternator cover. To install the water pump, lubricate the O-ring on the pump housing and install it with the part number on the gasket facing out. Rotate the impeller to align the square drive so that the body rests on the cases. Install the pump insert and cover, torquing the bolts in a crossing pattern. To prepare the engine for installation, install the rear injector into the head followed by the front. Rotate the manifolds into position and install the fasteners. Finish the assembly by connecting the sensor harnesses and installing the throttle body. Refer to PhD 163 for an overview of engine installation and preparation. If, after installing and prepping the engine, you notice a rattle on the vehicle startup, use this tool to inspect the condition of the secondary cam chain tension. With the airbox cover, filter, and horn removed, rotate the engine in a counterclockwise direction while observing the front cylinder's intake valve through the intake port. When the intake valve closes, turn the crankshaft an additional 90 degrees. With the engine in this position, remove the hydraulic tensioner and install the special inspection tool. With the tool installed, count the number of grooves visible on the center post. Use the chart in the manual to select the appropriate number of shims. Note that you should only add shims when 3 to 4 grooves are visible if there is a startup rattle. Remove the plunger from the tensioner and install the shims into the bore. Then insert the plunger and install the tensioner. To inspect the rear cylinder, again rotate the engine while observing the rear intake valve. The measurement procedure is the same as the front cylinder. This concludes this PhD training program. As with all programs, the procedures shown are subject to revision. Always refer to the most current service information when servicing the engine.